Welcome to this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic, where we're going to go through, and Cole's note, a very important U.S. Senate committee hearing on commerce, science, and transportation from September 3rd, 2025. The name of it? There's a Bad Moon on the Rise. Why Congress and NASA must thwart China in the space race. Senator Ted Cruz chaired the 2-hour session that included appearances from several experts in the aerospace industry, referred to as witnesses, including Mr. Alan Cutler, President and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, who is a friend of our channel that regularly takes our questions during their live press conferences. 2 of those conferences can be found in our back library as episodes. Next up is Mr. Michael Gold, President of Civil and International Space for Redwire, the Honorable Jim Bridenstine, Managing Partner of the Artemis Group and former Administrator for NASA under VP Mike Pence and President Trump, and finally Lieutenant General John Shaw, former Deputy Commander of the U.S. Space Command. There was also an unscheduled guest appearance by Bill Nye as a representative of the Northwest Planetary Society, but he was not called upon to speak. We're going to go through their opening statements, their testimonies, and responses to questions, pare down the wordiness and flag waving, and provide some additional visuals because this conversation was a very important one to understand properly for all fans of space exploration in light of recent advances made by China. And if you want to watch the entire thing yourself to compare notes, here's the video on YouTube to track down. But before we get into the meat of this, let's introduce you to our sponsor for today's episode, Outskill.com. Did you know that 78% of world business leaders are already using AI workers to cut down their operational costs and boost efficiency? The question isn't whether this technology will reshape business, it's whether you'll be leading the change or scrambling to catch up. But here's some good news if you want to learn how to make AI work for you. This weekend, you can join the 2-day AI Mastermind Workshop by Outskill, the world's first AI-focused education platform. Now, their training normally costs $895, but we've partnered with Outskill to give away 1,000 free seats just for our viewers. And we've gone ahead, checked their rating on Trustpilot for you, where they're rated 4.9 out of 5 on thousands of reviews. So, what makes them different? First, it's a short 16-hour commitment, which is best suited for someone with a busy professional schedule. You also get free lifetime access to Outskill's exclusive paid AI community to grow alongside over 5,000 AI-first professionals. And their AI learning dashboard is seamless to navigate, which enhances your overall learning experience. During their 2-day live training, you'll learn more than 10 powerful AI tools, prompt engineering, and automating your workflows and building AI products without code. Also, if you sign up now, you'll get bonuses worth $5,100, a prompt Bible with more than 3,000 high-impact prompts on day 1, a roadmap to monetize AI on day 2, and a personalized AI toolkit builder, but only if you attend both days. So Clear Your Weekend is happening this Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. on both days. Limited seats available and they're filling fast. Grab yours now via the link in the description. And thanks again to Outskill for helping make this episode possible. Okay, here we go, delving into a political arena discussion on what should not be a political agenda topic and should not be subject to partisan views, as Committee Chair Ted Cruz stated in his 6-minute opening monologue, along with his qualifications as chair, having served on his committee since President Obama.
Today we will discuss NASA's progress, its challenges, and the path forward on the first comprehensive NASA authorization bill since 2017. When I was chairman of this committee's space subcommittee, Senator Bill Nelson and I worked together on several pieces of space legislation that were signed into law by both Presidents Obama and President Trump. Continuing that bipartisan tradition, this past March, my colleagues and I together introduced a short-term NASA authorization bill. All of these efforts reveal an important truth. There exists a strong bipartisan consensus in Congress for backing the critical mission of NASA.
So in the spirit of bipartisanship, we're going to try our best to keep politics here to a minimum and maintain focus on the topic at hand, which is China's steady progress in their space and lunar programs.
This is a pivotal moment for our nation's space program. America must maintain leadership in low Earth orbit, while also embarking on a new era of exploration with Artemis. Make no mistake, we are in a new space race with China. And if we fail, there will be a bad moon on the rise. China has made no secrets of its goals. It is investing heavily in space capabilities, maintaining a permanent presence in low Earth orbit, and working to plant its flag on the moon by 2030. The stakes could not be higher. Space is no longer reserved simply for peaceful exploration. It is today a strategic frontier with direct consequences for national security, economic growth, and technological leadership. If our adversaries achieve dominant space capabilities, it would pose a profound risk to America. The choices we make today will determine whether the United States leads in space or cedes space to an authoritarian regime. That is why continuity in NASA's programs is not simply good practice. It is a matter of national security. Any drastic changes in NASA's architecture at this stage threaten United States leadership in space. Delays or disruptions only serve our competitors' interests. In the One Big Beautiful Bill, we reaffirm strong support for NASA's exploration programs. At a time when some have sought to prematurely dismantle the International Space Station, despite China's presence in low Earth orbit, Congress provided ample funding to continue the safe operations of the ISS, as well as to provide an on-ramp for follow-on commercial stations. And Congress also provided the funds necessary to sustain a presence on the moon. Artemis 4 will deliver and assemble the first major elements of the Gateway Station in lunar orbit, and Artemis 5 will expand surface exploration using that platform. These missions rely on the Space Launch System and Orion capsule to reach the moon and to reach the Gateway Station. It would be folly to cut short these missions after much of the hardware has already been purchased and in some cases delivered and with no commercial alternative readily available. Congress supports NASA's exploration goals, and we do not want sudden or disruptive changes that undermine America's leadership. The milestones ahead: maintaining continuous human presence in low Earth orbit, returning American astronauts to the moon, and preparing for human missions to Mars. These are not just scientific achievements. They are fundamental to America's role in the world's as the world's leading spacefaring nation. America must remain the world's leader in space. With steady leadership and clear direction, I'm confident that we will.
We tried to cut that down even further, but Cruz kept making one important point after another that will all be covered later on. So, long-winded it is. But now that Cruz has set the tone for these proceedings, the next speaker is Ranking Member Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington State. Summarizing Senator Cantwell's opening comments, she expressed her concern about America's race to the moon against China's growing influence in the realm of space. She also believes any challenges to American superiority in space represents a threat to American national security. And central to this is NASA landing astronauts on the moon using all the technology and innovation at their disposal. She calls back to the Apollo era, noting that much of the technology created during that program is still put to use today.
Returning to the moon requires us to push the limits of technology to find the solutions that we can solve and maintain our national defense and innovation economy. All you have to do is look back to the 1960s and look at the development of technologies that created an ecosystem within the United States of America that led to discoveries and innovations that we're still now counting on today.
And with the next lunar landing in mind, Cantwell is going to call upon the panelists today to tell her and the committee what experience they need to gather and what conditions they believe are required to help NASA achieve that goal. She acknowledges the focused attention that China places on achieving their national space program goals against the partnerships that NASA had fostered in an attempt to keep their lunar landing missions on track, and she quotes an important passage from the pre-submitted comments of General Shaw.
Quote, "I believe if we do not unify and synchronize our efforts, we will find ourselves, rather than the space leaders we are today, instead in a position of increasing disadvantage in space as we progress further into this century," end quote. I don't want to see that reality either.
Meanwhile, President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, Prime Minister Modi of India, and Kim Jong-un were participating in a joint summit to discuss their political and economic ties and alliances, although Kimmy seemed to have missed that particular photo op. Maria Cantwell, as the 25-year veteran senator for Washington State, is looking out for her key aerospace industrial partners. Blue Origin, Aerojet Rocketdyne, and Boeing's largest aircraft factory in the world all operate in her state. employing 100,000 of her voters. So she wants to discover through this hearing how to maximize the commercial space partnerships to get America back in the forefront of space exploration to avoid what she calls another Sputnik moment, while also ensuring that there are sufficient redundancies being provided through the program to cover any shortfalls. From here, Cruz introduces the 4 witnesses as we did earlier, and they provide their own 5-minute opening remarks, beginning with Alan Cutler. Cutler's opening remarks reflect an appreciation for the consistent bipartisan efforts in Congress to keep the Artemis program alive through to Artemis 5, thanks to the budget reconciliation bill, and he makes this declaration.
Artemis is more than a space program. It is a statement of American leadership to the rest of the world. It ensures that the United States, not our competitors or adversaries, sets the rules for lunar exploration and resource utilization. Without a successful Artemis program, we risk ceding the moon to China. Their intent is clear, their progress is real, and time is not on our side. China's persistence in achieving its national goals in space underscores its unfaltering intent to be the leader in space. The country that lands astronauts on the moon next shapes the rules of engagement in space for decades to come.
He also mentions that equipment is already being built for Artemis missions 3 through 9, representing an ecosystem and supply chain that would not easily be resurrected if it was again interrupted. Cutler mentions the deep financial impact the program has across the U.S., employing thousands of small businesses across the country, with federal funding creating $3 in local economic activity for every federal dollar spent, creating high-quality jobs, and driving innovation that historically has produced technology that in turn becomes part of our everyday life. And he wraps up referring to the Artemis Accords established in Trump's first term that united 56 nations in these attempts to return to the moon, and his motivation for appearing today is to secure an ongoing, unwavering commitment to NASA, allowing NASA to continue making this progress with its allies without losing steps each time a new federal administration is elected.
Congress can strengthen our national capabilities with a robust NASA authorization bill to reaffirm our commitment to the current plan and make improvements where necessary. It should continue the direction for lunar exploration found in the President's Space Policy Directive 1, which calls for the United States to lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars. A multi-year authorization bill with these elements will provide the long-term certainty needed to keep NASA focused and our workforce, our partners, and our allies aligned.
Mr. Gold is up next, and he brought his own upbeat energy to the hearing, enthusiastically thanking the Senate for their support of the Big Beautiful Bill Act that financed Artemis through to Artemis 5, which we haven't notated yet as the Blue Origin landing mission, now that they were brought back on board for the second Lunar Landing Development Contract. The BBB includes completing and launching Lunar Gateway, which is being produced by a host of partner nations to create a permanent station in orbit around the moon. 60% of Lunar Gateway funding, he mentions later on, is being provided by those partner nations that are tasked with building it. But as part of the 40% American content, Mr. Gold's company, Redwire, definitely has a vested interest in launching that orbital asset.
Specifically, per the direction of the One Big Beautiful Bill, NASA must complete and launch the Lunar Gateway. Just last month, along with NASA officials and representatives from all of our international partners, I watched the successful deployment test of Redwire's massive rollout solar arrays for the Gateway's power and propulsion element. These arrays, which will be some of the largest ever deployed by humanity in space, will power the Gateway, representing the pinnacle of solar electric propulsion technology, a key capability for both future civil space exploration and national security activities.
He mentions that the presence of Gateway will allow for lunar missions lasting 60 to 90 days, whereas without Lunar Gateway, missions would likely cap at 5 to 7 days, and the platform would also give the US the opportunity to monitor Chinese activities in cislunar space. Gold goes on to pump his company a little bit, as Redwire have also been conducting biomedical and pharmaceutical experiments with great success on the ISS, thereby notating the benefits of maintaining a station in orbit, even as there are discussions about American crew reduction on the ISS from 4 to 3 to 2, and eventually deorbiting the platform altogether. Mr. Gold is very concerned that there may be a period of time where the US has no space station in orbit between the deorbiting of the ISS and the launch of whatever platform comes next.
There is no question in my mind that microgravity manufacturing will transform the pharmaceutical and biotech fields. The only question is, will those benefits be enjoyed in China or here in the United States. If this committee's directives are not followed, for the first time in history, there will be more Chinese astronauts in space than Americans. This should be unacceptable. Together, we must speak out with one unified voice that we will not cede LEO, our international partnerships, and the moon to the tender mercies of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mr. Bridenstine started his 5-minute opening comments by confirming what Mr. Gold said about pharmaceuticals and manufacturing in space.
Everything he said about medicine and microgravity is correct. We are seeing transformational capabilities in pharmaceuticals because atoms and molecules organize differently in microgravity than they do here on Earth. We are either going to have that capability in the United States because we have a permanent human presence in space with a fully mission-capable space station, or we're going to cede that to China. It is really that simple. Then not only does that capability go to China, but all of our international partners go to China as well because they want that capability. This is a big deal.
Unless the US wants to lose those abilities while China obtains them, there needs to be some serious action taken. And then Bridenstine gets back on topic, making a lengthy statement about the current condition of NASA's lunar landing system, which was basically, they don't have one. We're mainly going to let this speech play out in its entirety because this is the former NASA administrator under Trump who issued the original tender letters for Artemis with the goal of a 2024 landing, saying exactly what we said in our Billionaire Space Race series about the questionable selection of Starship as a lunar lander. And for those who would argue that Bridenstine has ulterior motives by making these declarations, you have to find fault with what he testified to, which you won't be able to do because these are 100% fact.
The purpose of this hearing is, are we going to be able to get to the moon first? I mean, that's the title of the hearing. Look at the architecture that we have developed to land American astronauts on the moon. Look at the architecture. It is extraordinarily complex. It hinges on me saying here today that it is highly unlikely that we will land on the moon before China. And I'm going to explain it in the next 2 minutes. So, number one, we have the SLS rocket, which is the most powerful rocket ever built. Yes, it has had its problems in the past. It has been expensive. It had overruns, all those things, but it's behind us. It's done. We need to use it. We have the Orion crew capsule, which quite frankly is a shiny object in this whole thing. The Orion crew capsule is not only usable today, but ultimately the cost is going down because more and more of it is reusable every time we use the Orion crew capsule. Those two elements are in good shape. But I will say what we don't have today. Here's what we don't have today. We don't have a landing system for the moon. And there was a moment in time when we had no NASA administrator. It was after I was gone and before Senator Nelson became the NASA administrator, an architecture was selected. And I don't know how this happens, but the biggest decision in the history of NASA, at least since I've been paying attention, the biggest decision happened in the absence of a NASA administrator. And that decision was, instead of buying a moon lander, we're going to buy a big rocket. And I want to be clear, we need this rocket to be successful. It's important for the country and it's transformational. But in the meantime, the architecture is as such. We need to launch Starship. That first Starship is a fueling depot that's in orbit around the Earth. Then we need to launch, nobody really knows, but it could be up to dozens of additional Starships to refuel the first Starship. So imagine launching Starship over and 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 over, dozens of times, no delays, no explosions, to refuel the first Starship. Then once it's fully refueled, then that Starship has to fuel another Starship that is in fact human-rated, which that process hasn't even started yet. By the way, that whole in-space refueling thing has never been tested either. We're talking about cryogenic liquid oxygen, cryogenic liquid methane being transferred in space, never been done before, and we're gonna do it dozens of times, and then we're gonna have a human-rated Starship that is refueled that goes all the way to the moon. Now, when it goes to the moon, we don't know how long it can be there because it's boiling off the entire time it's in orbit around the moon. We don't know how long it can be there, but while it's there, we have to launch the SLS, we have to launch the Orion, the European Service Module, we have to have astronauts and crew all ready to go. And they have to orbit the moon themselves in that window when Starship is around the moon, and then they have to dock around the moon. They have to transfer from the Orion into the Starship. It has to go down and land. When it's on the surface of the moon, Starship is gone, or Orion is gone for the next 7 days until it comes back around in near rectilinear halo orbit. So our astronauts are right now planning to be on the surface of the moon for a period of 7 days without any way home. This is an architecture that no NASA administrator that I'm aware of would have selected had they had the choice. But it was a decision that was made in the absence of a NASA administrator in the last administration. It's a problem, it needs to be solved, and that puts us as a nation at risk of not being the first on the moon. I should say the first next on the moon, because we did land in 1969 to 1972.
For those keeping score, this would be total vindication of our Billionaire Space Race Series opinion that Kathy Lueders had absolutely no business making that decision. And further, the decision she single-handedly made against the reporting of the advisory panel has since been questioned at the highest levels due to its, frankly, ridiculous operational paradigm, which was a key argument when Bezos tried to block this award through the GAO and through the courts. We knew the instant that this award was announced on April 16, 2021, that NASA, through Lueders, selecting this insane architecture using an unproven rocket that had never launched before and has still not made a full orbit, was going to cost NASA the moon. And here we are, over 4 years later, and that's exactly what everyone is realizing now. Restating this position within the context of this hearing, NASA, and therefore the United States government, has gambled their national prestige in space, and therefore their national security, by placing their faith in this ridiculous paradigm that is unproven in every regard, with complete reliance on a jumbo rocket that is very unlikely to ever see the lunar surface. General Shaw was the fourth witness to give opening remarks as a former leader of the U.S. Air Force and later the U.S. Space Force, serving his country for 33 years and cooperating with NASA and NOAA during that time. He's been working for the past 2 years on the civilian side of aerospace, making him unique on this panel for his dual leadership roles. He appeared today for this purpose.
My bottom line up front for the committee today is that I am an advocate for and a champion of a unified grand space strategy for our nation, for the Earth-Moon system and beyond. Yet such a grand strategy, which would unify and synergize our national efforts across civil, commercial, and national security activities in pursuit of common goals, opportunities, and capabilities, does not currently exist. And I believe our mission to return Americans to the moon can be a powerful and a central driver, as well as a beneficiary of such a strategy.
He not only believes this strategy is necessary, he acknowledges it does not exist in the U.S. at this time. And further, as an observant soldier monitoring his perceived adversary, he believes this is exactly how China is pursuing their aerospace goals across civil, commercial, and national security interests. As a military leader, Shaw seems to understand the mantra that infantry wins battles, but logistics win wars. And to that end, Shaw wants a unified grand scheme for the Earth-Moon system to include full logistics as required to keep a sustained human presence on the moon, with a full manufacturing ecosystem to back it up. He presently rates the Artemis logistic and supply chains as disorganized and inconsistent, which does not encourage further investment in those systems. And he shares reports that in the month prior to this hearing, the Chinese have been observed docking craft in orbit, possibly refilling propellant, and conducting maneuvers. And Shaw's final point brings up the need to develop nuclear fusion systems for use in space, not just for lunar outposts, but for other spacecraft and on Earth as well, which would have huge commercial applications. Now we're into the Q&A, and Cruz starts off asking Bridenstine about China. We'll hear the question from Cruz, the response from Bridenstine, and then summarize both.
Mr. Bridenstine, China is racing to control the moon and low Earth orbit, and they're not shy about using space to expand their power on Earth. If America doesn't beat them, if we cede the lunar surface or continuous presence in orbit to Beijing, what does that mean for our national security, our economy, and America's leadership?
Here's how I view things, and I think the general will appreciate this from my time as a lieutenant in the Navy. We did joint professional military education, and we learned this thing called the DIME theory of national power: diplomatic, information, military, economic power. When I was at the helm of NASA, my goal was to always think about what we're doing in those elements. How does this advance diplomatic power? How does it advance information power, military power, and economic power? On the diplomatic side, we have 15 different countries that are operating the International Space Station today. We've had astronauts from, I think, 21 different countries at this point. We've got over 600 or 700 agreements now internationally as it relates to missions. NASA is a key element of diplomatic power for this country. I will tell you, I don't think it's often used correctly. I mean, we could put it on the table for a whole host of carrot and stick kind of activities to benefit the United States of America and an America First policy. On the information power side of things, one of my first eye-opening experiences at NASA, when we landed InSight on Mars. This was a lander that was going to land on Mars and help us understand Mars quakes. Well, when we landed InSight on Mars, it was on the cover of every newspaper worldwide. That's amazing information power, including the hardline newspaper of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. Now, I'm not saying we want to win their press, but it was a story about how we landed on Mars. And it was a story about how we did it, when we did it, what we were doing. And it had a list at the end. The last was all of our international partners that participated with us in that. This is a newspaper in Iran where they don't get good information about the United States of America, but when we land on Mars, it changes things. It changes the perception of young people towards this country that we love. Of course, everybody likes to talk Apollo 11 when we landed on the moon and the whole world watched. I mean, that's information power that we reference even today. On the military side, NASA is not strong. We don't play military. We don't report to the Secretary of Defense, but a lot of our technologies and capabilities, in fact, have dual use capability. One thing that concerns me greatly right now is the devastating consequences happening to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California, JPL. They're the ones that build all the Mars landers. They're the ones that have landed on Mars 9 times in history. But a lot of that technology, make no mistake, has military application, and we're at risk of losing a lot of that. That's the military side of things, but it's really not where NASA plays. NASA plays in exploration, science, discovery. The E is economic power. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, regenerative medicines, advanced materials, article came out, China is using their space station to create new advanced materials for hypersonics, materials that my understanding is we don't have right now, although maybe somebody knows something I don't know. At the end of the day, we have to use microgravity, where we know atoms and molecules organize differently. We have to use it to our advantage, and advanced materials, China is doing that. We're not doing it the way we should, and we're at risk of losing it. So all of those elements, I think, are important. When we think about the great power competition with China, we need to think about NASA being used for diplomatic power, information power, military power, and economic power.
So the summary here is that NASA is not only a multifaceted organization, it is also multifaceted as a projection of national power across the DIME acronym. And as we mentioned during this hearing, there's a lot of flag waving by all parties here. National security, as we counted, was mentioned no less than 26 times during the 2-hour proceeding. And this breakdown by Bridenstine sets the tone for how and why NASA factors into national security as a diplomatic engine, an information engine, to a lesser extent a military engine, but certainly as an economic engine. So there will be down-the-chain fallouts when a facility such as JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs, gets targeted for a decrease in funding. Despite being the organization that built and landed rovers on Mars, sent probes out to every planet in the solar system, and created the Ingenuity helicopter for Mars aboard Perseverance, which exceeded all expectations with 72 flights before being grounded by rotor damage. Not to mention creating Voyagers 1 and 2, which they not only built and launched, but continue to monitor. JPL's robotic missions funding for 2026 would be disproportionately affected by the White House request to cut NASA funding by 47%, which is why Jim made a point of stating how universally the NASA Mars missions are covered in the press. And that loss of ability will accompany a loss of accomplishment and a loss of prestige, downstreaming as a potential loss of national partnerships, seriously affecting the diplomatic power that NASA is currently famous for. Next question from Cruz is to Mr. Gold, focusing on how China is concurrently building up their own prestige as NASA faces these cutbacks.
Gateway will be America's eye in the sky in cislunar space, extending our lunar surface program by enabling longer missions, heavy equipment delivery, and protection of U.S. assets, while paving the way for advanced infrastructure like Interim Administrator Duffy's goal of a lunar nuclear reactor by 2030. Meanwhile, China has made it clear that it intends to build its own cislunar station as a platform to dominate the moon and to pursue critical resources such as helium-3. Mr. Gold, in your judgment, why is it critical that the United States lead with Gateway and cislunar before China builds its own cislunar station and uses it to control the moon?
When I was at NASA, I got a briefing on our ability, or should I say inability, to monitor Chinese activities in cislunar space. I didn't sleep for a week. You hear democracy dies in darkness. Our freedom could die in the depths of space if we are not able to monitor and understand what's happening with space situational awareness around the moon. Relative to nuclear on the moon, you mentioned helium-3. It's not just about the moon, it's about Earth. The countries and companies that control the moon will control the Earth. It's just a matter of time. Rare earth elements, helium-3. We need to be able to extract these resources. We need to be able to learn to live off the land. I'm a native of the great state of Montana, did a lot of camping and fishing. I can't imagine going on those camping trips if I had to bring all of my air, all of my water, all of my food, all of my oxygen. You can't have a sustainable, robust presence or support economic activities if you can't live off the land. And we can't do that without nuclear. And I cannot praise Secretary Duffy enough for acknowledging that this isn't about just going back to the moon. This is about going back to the moon, harnessing its resources for the Earth, and establishing infrastructure and a permanent presence. Very much appreciate Secretary Duffy's decisive action, his decisive leadership in elevating the head of the Moon Mars program to associate administrator, the highest civil servant post at NASA. That sends an important message, not just to NASA, but to our international partners and even to China, that we're back. We are reigniting the torch of Artemis, and we're going to go forward to the moon. I can tell you the NASA civil servants needed to hear that. They're justifiably skeptical. NASA has failed to sustain a beyond LEO human spaceflight program since Apollo. Failure hasn't just been an option, it's been a certainty. And if we cannot show that we can be a good partner, that we can be a reliable partner, all the benefits that we talked about, diplomatically, economically, will go to others.
For starters, while we agree with many of the points that Cruz made in the preamble to the question, we do have some questions about the role of Lunar Gateway. Making it possible for longer mission duration from 5 to 7 days to 60 to 90 days, that seems probable with the right logistics. But the point we question goes to the delivery of heavy equipment to the lunar surface through Gateway, and really through the Artemis roadmaps seen to date. In fact, we recently got into a very short debate with the everyday astronaut that he quickly bowed out of about the Artemis 3 roadmap with regards to Starship HLS. We asked him if he even knew where that vehicle would physically be located at the end of Artemis 3, and he did not. Here's the mission architecture as depicted. Starship HLS, once launched and refilled with over 20 tanker loads, heads out in translunar injection for their destination in NRHO around the moon, attached to Gateway. In theory, this ship could have a reasonable payload in the cargo bay. SLS then launches Orion to meet Gateway, transfer personnel to Gateway, and then to Starship for the landing. In theory, they land on the moon, conduct their mission, and at the mission's end, the astronauts launch from the moon in Starship without benefit of tower nor pad protecting the engines from debris, to meet back up with Gateway to reverse the process, coming home to Earth aboard Orion. And at that point, Starship HLS is sitting empty of both propellant and cargo in NRHO, not in LLO, awaiting refilling as Tim Dot claimed. To refill either aspect would require additional starships making their trip to the moon, making this particular craft redundant. And again, the presence of Gateway would not seem to have any effect on the logistics of that particular situation. But moving into the next points made by Mr. Gold, he considers having Gateway in place before the Chinese almost as an existential point, laying out his argument that whoever controls the moon will ultimately control Earth. And one of the things mentioned by both Cruz and Gold is helium-3. For those people wondering why helium-3 would be a key concern, helium-3 is proposed to be the linchpin required to solve nuclear fusion. Key word here is proposed, not proven. On Earth, helium-3 is created as an isotope of decaying tritium with no artificial way to create it, and it is extremely rare, costing upwards of $50,000 per gram. Some estimates, including those based on minute samples of lunar regolith, estimate the moon's 38 million square kilometer surface may contain 1 million tons of this monoatomic molecule that would be spread out across an area roughly 4 times the size of Canada. with some concentrations of helium-3 heavy around the near side equator, while the water ice deposits that everyone gets excited about are mainly located at the South Pole. If it was spread out evenly, you're talking a matter of kilograms per every 100 hectares. But since we're talking about gases on the moon, and Gould's next anecdote was about his camping trips in Montana and how he would not want to have to bring his own air with him, carrying over into an ability to live off the land, we won't be making breathable air on the moon, because if you think Mars was nitrogen poor, the moon is even worse off, and nitrogen occupies 78% of the air we take in. People seem to disengage their brain when talking about other planets as soon as they hear that planet has water or water ice, because oxygen can be harvested from water ice with simple electrolysis, but that's only 22% of the gas we breathe. Now, in theory, humans could breathe in an 80-20 gas mix where nitrogen is replaced by helium-3, which is what they're going there to mine, which would make live vocal communications between the Earth and the Moon rather interesting.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
It would, in theory, be safe enough, with helium-3 acting as a diluent gas as nitrogen does, but there doesn't seem to be anybody working on that as a possibility, possibly due to the cost of helium-3 on Earth. Helium-4, on the other hand, is used all the time in deep-sea diving rigs. The industry term for that gas mix is heliox. But for the other conditions of living off the land, i.e. self-sustaining colony conditions, we go back to the same issues that we foresee with Mars, where you have to bring almost everything with you. The only difference here being the length of the journey between Earth and the colony destination. But seeing as how we have no self-sustaining facilities, much less cities, on Earth, the folly of thinking we could somehow produce this on another world makes that concept easy to dismiss. And for proof, we need to look no further than a facility we referenced several times in our early episodes, Biosphere 2 in Arizona, where twice a carefully engineered sealed ecosystem of over 3 acres, with Earth gravity and sunshine regimens, was unable to sustain 8 people on the first try and 7 people on the second and final attempt. Suffice to say, before planning any self-sufficient facilities on the moon, we need to work out well in advance how to do that on Earth. And then the last segment of Gould's reply deals with the effect an unstable support for NASA has on the partnerships that they fostered. Cutler stated that there was hardware being worked on presently for Artemises 3 through 9. Well, as we mentioned, not all of that work is being done by American companies. Take the Orion stack, for example. Although the Orion capsule itself is being produced by Lockheed Martin, the European Space Agency has contracted Airbus to build a European service module for that craft. The abrupt cancellation of Artemis would leave them with generations of very expensive equipment that served no other purpose, and would most certainly result in the ESA thinking twice about ever partnering up again on any major ventures with NASA. That's just one example. The Gateway is another, with contributions being made by the Canadian, European, and Japanese space agencies, along with the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center out of Dubai. More partners that would not appreciate being left out in the cold because the US couldn't make a firm commitment on the program they invited these partners into. And now it's Washington State Senator Cantwell's turn to ask a question, and she starts off with an historical anecdote.
The time is here to think bigger about the implementation of all the things. It reminds me sitting here how a colleague once said to me, you know, your state should be called Jefferson. It was President Jefferson who basically made the big decision to send Lewis and Clark at a critical moment in our country's history to go all the way across the United States to try to find if there was a faster path and lay claim to the Pacific Northwest. It brings up this point about the predicate of getting there first. And I don't know if this is you, Mr. Gould, or Lieutenant General Shaw, but there are areas, particularly the south pole of the moon, that are critically and strategically important. And getting there a timely fashion to claim those resources or claim that space seems to be just as critical as Jefferson's decision to get us all the way out to the Pacific.
Senator, I would say even more critical than Jefferson's decision, because this doesn't affect the country, this affects the whole world. And you're exactly right. The moon is a large place, but the number of locations that have the combination of water ice, sunlight, and other aspects that we need are actually relatively limited. And we could lose those to the Chinese if we don't move quickly. Additionally, the countries that get there first will write the rules of the road for what we can do on the moon, how we act. We've had tremendous success with the Artemis Accords. 56 countries have signed. The Chinese only have 13 for their International Lunar Space Research Station program. But if we're not first, trust me, those numbers will change. And the fear, China will eventually outspend us in space. It's inevitable. We must out-entrepreneur them. And that's why I'm so grateful for one of your constituents, Blue Origin, for example. And for some reason, this doesn't get, I think, enough play. They have spent billions of their own money to support the HLS system. They're going to launch a Mark I spacecraft to the moon, paid for all on their own dime. So
I'm assuming everybody's for the redundancy of the lunar system, the lander system. Yes.
Absolutely, because you have to have two. You need that for efficiency, you need that for competition, you need that for safety. But again, if we don't get out there and get there first, we'll lose real estate, we'll lose the rules of the road, and we'll lose the international partnerships and the economic benefits. And helium-3, that could be a new clean power revolution that we're going to let the Chinese Communist Party have.
Mr. Gold's response to the question is somewhat alarmist, to say the least. So maybe this is as good a time as any to bring up a couple of facts about China that we were going to hold off on until the end. First off, China is often framed as America's enemy, yet it is the third largest trading partner of the US behind Mexico and Canada. So that rhetoric really falls flat on many faces. Why would you import $500 billion of goods per year to financially support your enemy? Well, the answer there is simpler and more complex than you might think, with a parallel found in a Chinese ally, North Korea. Kim Jong-un is the supreme leader of North Korea, which has a society that heavily favors the Korea People's Army in the distribution of resources. This is a practice known as Sungun. But such a military-first policy can only be justified if that nation has a mortal enemy that it must be ever vigilant against, which in the case of North Korea is the US. Now, as the largest military-industrial complex in the world, with an annual defense budget in the trillions, who just renamed the Department of Defense as the Department of War, the United States must also have declared enemies in order to justify the resources allocated to the military at home and abroad. And the enemy of choice in this case is China. Second, as an historical note of interest, although both world wars happened prior to the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, China was an ally of the Allied powers in both conflicts, not an enemy. But third, and most importantly on this topic, China attempted to get involved with the ISS when the United States was first taking on international partners. In the 1990s, the International Space Station was developed as a collaborative project between nations, including Canada, Russia, the European Space Agency partners, and Japan. China was excluded due to the US concerns over its secretive, military-linked space program, national security risk, and perceived technological inexperience. In 2007, China expressed interest in ISS cooperation. The European Space Agency, as a nation partner, proposed to bring Chinese astronauts, known as taikonauts, aboard in 2010, but the US vetoed that. And in 2011, they went one step further with the Wolf Amendment, a congressional law that prohibited NASA from bilateral cooperation with China without FBI clearance, effectively barring ISS participation due to fears over human rights violations, military dual-use technology, and a 2007 anti-satellite missile test that created orbital debris. This decision against China got Neil deGrasse Tyson pretty riled up at TAM 2011 in Las Vegas. And who was he sat next to? Bill Nye, who also attended this Senate hearing. We've played a shorter version of this clip before, but listen to Nye's statement made 3 months after the Wolf Amendment was passed 15 years ago in April of 2011. Listen to it in the context for today's hearing, before Tyson offers his statement on it. Also, while we're at it, recognize the pure ignorance of Lawrence Krauss when it comes to the function and purpose of the ISS. He was obviously sat at the far end of the table for a reason.
I grew up in the US, I mentioned that, but what I've tried to do now, I wrote this op-ed, just remind people in the US Congress and Senate that if you don't want to discover what makes the universe accelerate, maybe somebody in another country, maybe somebody from China.
But you agree with me that those discoveries won't be made by humans orbiting 200 miles above the Earth. They'll be made by wonderful spacecraft that are efficient.
Designed by humans.
Yeah, but designed by humans that actually, are cost effective. You said the key point. I mean, the difference between Antarctica and the International Space Station is, I don't know what the NSF, Neil probably knows what the NSF budget is for Antarctica. It's probably
can't talk
less than
about it.
$50 million a year, I don't know. But the space station is a $100 billion
man.
tin can sitting up there doing absolutely nothing.
Well, so here's what would be really good use of it, is to get taikonauts on board.
That's Chinese astronauts?
Chinese space flyers would be fantastic, because another Cold War or even the beginning of a Cold War is very, very expensive undertaking.
Well,
and anything we do to diffuse it would be good.
That's actually one of the big problems that we're dealing with right now in terms of trying to make science in space something that's achievable, because most nations in the world are dealing with economic crises right now. And China is doing quite well, and they're planning their own space agency. They have their own space agency. They've launched their own men into space. They're in the process of planning their own independent space station that's theirs. And if we could just partner with them more.
Because we denied their access to our space station,
True.
citing human rights violations. As a result, they said, we still want to go to space, we'll do it without you. And they built their own space program and became the third spacefaring nation to put a human being into orbit, and their ambitions remain high.
And this year they tested #1 in science and technology.
So we tick you off, Neil?
So 15 years ago, the U.S. government under then President Barack Obama created this adversarial situation regarding space exploration between the U.S. and China, while contemporaneously overseeing the retirement of the space shuttle fleet and mothballing the Moon to Mars program created by George W. Bush, known as Constellation, with the U.S. then ceding their ability to launch their own men into space to the Russians through their Soyuz platform. So when you hear later in the hearing how the priorities of NASA are changed with each new federal administration, you now have some additional context to apply to the statement, as well as the history of how China has been going it on their own in aerospace since being banned from the ISS 15 years ago, and have now, instead of becoming a working partner, have become a force to be reckoned with, and that has got a lot of people here very nervous. And we're going to end this episode here, as we've spent an hour going over the first half of the hearing, when we were supposed to be making this a short summary of the hearing. However, hopefully the information we're adding to the mix here is giving some additional context and food for thought on the topic. If there's enough interest in a part 2, we'll pick this up later in the month, as our fall schedule at home is getting pretty full. So let us know in the comments if you'd like us to keep going, or if you just want to watch the second half of the hearing for yourself. So again, thank you for tuning in to this episode, and depending on the feedback, we might pick this up at the halfway mark in the coming weeks. And finally, don't forget to grab your free seat for the Outskill Masterclass coming up this weekend.